Hi, I'm Emily.
And I'm Amelia.
And we're the co-founders of Wildflower Delivery Co., a modern sewing kit company. Today, we're sewing our canvas tote bag. To make this project, we'll be learning and practicing 3 main skills: creating a fully lined item using 2 pieces of the same shape, making a pocket with a continuous piece of fabric, and installing leather handles with brass hardware.
So let's jump in.
The kit comes with everything you'll need to complete the project. Access to step-by-step illustrated instructions corresponding to the steps in this video, fabric yardage custom printed with the textile design you chose and the pattern piece templates, and a notions kit with a preloaded bobbin, matching thread, sewing pins, a printed seam gauge and a marking pencil, a graduated awl, beautiful leather handles, hand sewing needles, Chicago screws, a little washer to tighten those screws, and just because things don't go as planned all the time, we have a seam ripper. There are 3 additional tools you'll need to complete the project. You need a sewing machine, an iron, and scissors. Before we jump in, I'm going to explain the basics of the project and a few key steps. So we're using 2 layers of heavyweight canvas to create a structured tote. Now, working with slightly heavier fabrics creates a beautiful finished piece, but comes with a little extra bulk. We'll go through ways of managing this as we're sewing. Now, for an overview of the steps. First, you'll create a lining pocket by making a big pleat in the fabric and top stitching it. Then you'll sew 2 lining pieces together around 3 edges, making them into a 2-dimensional bag shape. To give the bag 3-dimensional width, you'll pinch the bottom corners out and sew across them. Then you'll repeat the same steps for the exterior bag pieces. After you have 2 sewn bag shapes, you'll stack them inside of each other and stitch around the top edge. You'll turn this whole thing right sides out via an opening left in the bag lining, and then you'll finish the bag by attaching leather handles with brass screw hardware. We'll start with a few notes about our Paperless Patterns system. The textile print extends all the way out to the cut line of the pattern pieces, and the pattern pieces are designed with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. So, just to be clear, the seams are the line of stitching that hold the pieces together, and the seam allowance is the extra space between the stitch line and the edge of the fabric that will end up on the inside of the piece. Because the textile print extends past the stitch line to the cut line, even if you don't stitch everything perfectly straight, you'll never see a gap or any unprinted fabric. The fabric is also printed directly with notches, so there's no need to clip them. Notches are small marks perpendicular to the cut edge that act as guides while you're sewing. For this project, the notches indicate how to sew the lining pocket, indicate where to keep the opening on the lining open, and match up corresponding pieces. You'll also notice that there's a piece labeled extra fabric, not a pattern piece. For some of our project layouts, even though we Tetris these pieces to reduce scrap waste, we had a little area of unused space. We filled those small sections with extra textile print for you, but they won't be used in the project. So, the pattern pieces are printed directly on the fabric, and we'll just go ahead and cut around the lines. So I have our 4 rectangle pattern pieces cut out. These identical rectangles will be sewn together to become the exterior. These other 2 rectangles, one very long and one very short, will become the lining, with the extra length on this piece becoming the interior pocket. So we'll start by constructing that pocket in this long piece. And this is a super simple method of making a pocket with a continuous piece of cloth that has a pleat, and then the side seams of the bag will hold that into place, and then we'll top stitch down the center to bisect it into smaller compartments. So this piece has several different guide notches along the edges. I'm going to start with these wider notches that are roughly in the center, and I'm going to pinch a fold so that the notches become the top folded edge. So I'm going to pinch that out, and then just using my hands, I will press that into place and then pin along that edge. So this edge is pinned and will become the top edge of the interior pocket, like this. Now, with the side of the rectangle where you can see both the flat side and the long side facing up, we're going to take this and stitch along the folded edge at 1/4 inch. Now, for this top stitch on the fold, I'm lining up the edge of the fabric with the notch in my presser foot that indicates on my machine 1/4 inch. The important part of this stitch is that it remains straight and consistent. The actual distance from the edge is a personal preference. Line the folded and stitched edge up with the matching wider notch to create the pocket fold right here. And then we're going to pin along the sides to secure it. Pinning the pocket sides secures it for the next step, but eventually the side seams of the actual bag will be holding this in place. And to double check that you folded this correctly, you can check that the rounded tip notch is in the bottom fold of the pocket. So now you get to decide how you want to divide up the inner pocket. For my sample, I'll divide it in half, but if you'd like, you can divide it more specifically based on things you know you'll be carrying. A tall, skinny pocket for pencils, for example, and you can make those based on specific dimensions. To mark the halfway point, I'll fold the rectangle in half and crease it with my fingers. Do it. Then I'll pin the top and the bottom to mark it. So I can see that crease, and I'm just pinning the top and the bottom right where the bottom of the pocket fold is here. Then, starting at the folded edge, I'm going to stitch down this perpendicular crease. So because this connection will get some strain as you use the pockets, we're going to start the top stitch with a bar tack. You've probably seen this stitch on jeans to reinforce the pocket edges or on the fly to secure the opening that gets more stress as you pull the jeans on. That's what we'll do on the top here. So essentially a bar tack is a dense zigzag that creates a sturdy bar of stitching. To make this, we'll set the machine to a zigzag stitch, and then we'll adjust the length between 1 and 0, and we'll adjust the width to right about 2. Then I'll put the fabric underneath the presser foot and line up that center marking pin and the top of my fabric with the center of the needle point. I'm going to take that pin out as well. You don't want to stitch over it. So we'll start the bar tack like we would any other stitch by doing a turn of the hand wheel and a back stitch. Now, as I'm sewing, you might think that the fabric actually isn't advancing through the machine, but it is moving. It's just moving much slower than when you're doing a normal stitch because the stitch length is so short. So it'll look kind of like it's not going anywhere, but it is moving forward. Now I'm going to continue this for about 1/4 inch, and then with the needle up and the presser foot down, I'm going to set the machine back up for a standard straight stitch. So straight stitch, length between 2 and 3, and the width back down to 0. Then I will continue stitching all the way to that bottom pin that's marking the bottom of the pocket, and I'll do a back stitch there. Now your inner pocket is constructed and the 2 lining pieces have identical rectangular silhouettes. So next we're going to sew the 2 bag lining pieces together on 3 sides to create a 2-dimensional bag shape. You'll notice that the short sides, the top and the bottom, on one of those there's a set of notches about 4 inches apart centered. This is the bottom edge. You want to line up both pieces facing each other, right sides together, and the right side is the bright printed side, remember? matching these notches on the bottom. Now you can pin the bottom edge, and to mark those notches, I'm going to use a double pin. So the bottom is pinned, and when I sew around the bag, I'm going to leave this 4-inch space unsewn. This opening is going to be how you eventually turn the tote bag right side out when you sew the lining and the exterior pieces together. Then I'm going to pin along the 2 long sides. And as I'm pinning here, I can remove the pins that were holding the pocket pleat in place and reinsert them to catch the second piece of fabric. This is a little bit of a bulky area, so it might be a little bit tough to get these pins in here. So lastly, I'm going to use the pencil that was included in the kit, and I'm going to mark the bottom corners here. We know that they're the bottom because that's the side that is pinned. I'm going to mark them at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So it should be measured a 1/2 inch from either side of the corner. And normally I would never tell you to use pencil on fabric, but this is such thick fabric that it won't show through and it will be really helpful. So I'm marking that corner on the side that I'll be stitching. And then we'll take this to the machine and we'll sew at a 1/2 inch all the way around the edges. Starting from one top corner, stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So start with a back stitch and then continue down the side of the bag. If your machine has trouble transitioning from the 2 layers of canvas to the 4 layers in the pocket portion, you can use your hand wheel to get it started, and try not to pull the fabric backwards too hard. If you pull the fabric while the needle is going up and down, it can actually pull the needle and cause it to hit the needle plate instead of going straight through the opening into the shuttle, which can bend or break the needle. So just slow and steady there. When you get close to the 1/2 inch mark on the corner, use your hand wheel to make those last few stitches until the needle point is piercing right through that pencil mark that you marked out. Now, with the needle down, we're going to pick the presser foot up and pivot the fabric 90 degrees. Putting the presser foot down, you'll see that the bottom edge is now parallel with the presser foot. So continue stitching, and you'll stitch until your presser foot approaches that double pin mark you made. We're going to stop stitching about 1 inch from that mark and give ourselves a hefty back stitch. Then you'll start stitching right after that double pin, but you'll leave those pins in, so they'll end up in the back of your presser foot, and you'll start stitching again starting with that back stitch. This will leave a gap in the seam about 5 inches. And the turning step that I mentioned earlier would put a lot of stress on this opening, so the back stitches are pretty important. From here, we'll continue the stitch around, repeating the same pivot process at the opposite corner. Now the bag lining is a large 2D pocket shape. To start the next stage, I'll remove the marking pins, and then with my hand, I'll kind of open the bag up and give the bottom a crease so that I can arrange the piece like kind of a house shape. It'll be like a little funky getting it in there, but you'll get it in kind of a house shape, and then you'll start to open up these seam allowances, and you'll want the top corner here to have these kind of bunny ears. So as you're doing this, you'll notice that the seam allowance doesn't really want to open because there's a ton of bulk here. So we're going to start at the bottom of the pocket fold, trim out this seam allowance to about 1/8 for 2 layers. So I'll start trimming that at the bottom, and I'm going to trim up that seam allowance, just the top 2 layers, leaving the last layer of that side intact. And I'm going to trim until I get to the top of the pocket fold. And you'll notice you like hit that fold, and so you can kind of just trim out from there. With that extra bulk gone, you'll be able to press that fold open much easier. So you'll start that with your fingers, but then you can use the iron, and on a steam setting it's helpful to really press that fold out. Seam here. I'm just using my fingers and the iron to flatten that out, and then we'll repeat the exact same process on the other side. Both sides of the seams trimmed and pressed flat, fold the house point over to reveal the bottom diamond. Now we're going to arrange the seam allowances open and press flat. Where we left the gap, fold those seam allowances over 1/2 inch as if the seam were there and press that. You'll notice that the bottom center line extends straight through to the side seam, kind of right here. This process is both helping us press the bag really flat and also square it off and line it up for the next step where we transform it into a 3-dimensional shape. So take one of the bottom triangle corners and you'll pierce through the seam with a pin. The point of the pin should come straight through the center of the other side of the seam. This means that the center line is lined up. Now, you'll notice that there are notches on the side seam about 1.5 inches from the bottom. Place the straight edge across the side seam at the notches. What you're making here is an isosceles triangle that's bisected with that center line. Take your pencil and mark straight across there. To double check this if you'd like, you can measure the length of each side of the triangle and they should be the same. Now, we'll stitch across the edge perpendicular to the side seam, backstitching several times at the beginning and the end of the seam. I want this to be very secure. These will end up being the bottom corners of the bag, so you want to reinforce them because they will get a lot of stress. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning, with heavier weight material, I'm making some of my construction decisions based on how thick the fabric is and how to best manage the extra bulk that comes with these layers. Finishing the lining piece is a great example of that. For the exterior of the tote, we're going to actually fold this triangle that we've sewn up and tack it along the side seam for extra strength in the bottom. But if we were to finish the lining in the same way, the 2 layers next to each other in the finished piece would create a really bulky area. So instead, we're going to sew a second line of stitching about 1/8 inch from the point with back stitches, and then we'll trim it really quite close to that second line of stitching. Now the bag has a structured shape and a flat bottom, and the lining is fully constructed. So we'll set this aside and focus on the exterior. We're going to follow very similar steps for the exterior, except it's even easier because we don't have a pocket to deal with and we don't have to leave an opening in the bottom. So we'll start by lining up the pieces right side together and make sure that we've oriented ourselves on the pieces. The pointed triangle notches indicates the bottom edge. So right sides together, then we'll sew around the edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, side, bottom, side. And then press the seams out flat, pinch the triangle bottoms out, mark them, stitch across them, and then we'll stop and finish the bottom edges slightly differently than we did the lining piece. Once you have the exterior piece to the step where you sew across the bottom corner, hold the piece with the side seam facing up. We'll clip the bunny ears off the top, and then we'll also clip out the seam allowance from the base of the triangle to the tip about 1/16 inch. So your piece should look like this. Now, fold the triangle up along the side seam so that the stitched edge is on the fold. Leaving a triangle here will help give the bag structure to stand and give the bottom corners of the bag, which get a lot of wear, extra reinforcement. So we're actually going to use a hand sewing needle to tack this piece into place. So grab a needle and grab about 20 inches of thread from the spool on your machine. So trim the end of the thread so that it isn't frayed, and then slide that end through the eye of the needle. And we're going to use this thread doubled. So in order to finish this off, we can take both ends of the thread, and to make the knot, I just wrap it around my forefinger a couple of times pretty loosely, and then slide my thumb over it, and then you can pull this thread out, and it makes a really nice like fat end knot. So we're just going to be stitching, tacking the corner here up, and we're going to be stitching through the seam allowances. So we're going to stitch through the seam allowance here and the seam allowance here, just to secure that into place. And this is going to be completely invisible, and it's going to be on the inside of the bag. In order to make these tacking stitches, I'm just going up and down about 3 or 4 times. And then I'll do that on one side, and then I'll go over the center line and go up and down 3 or 4 times on this other side here. Now, tacking this corner up really isn't structural, but it ensures that the piece remains flush to the edge once the bag is lined and finished. So I'll repeat this same tacking process on the other bottom corner, and then we'll move on to the next step. Once you've tacked that into place, just give it a nice double knot. You now have 2 bag-shaped pieces that are very similar, except the lining piece has a pocket and the exterior piece is taller in dimension. The reason the exterior piece is taller is that the top edge will fold over to the inside and create a facing. So take the exterior of the bag. It should be inside out with the seam allowances on the outside and the pattern side of the fabric on the inside. And then take your lining piece and turn it so that it's right side out, and you can see the printed side on the outside. Now we will nest the lining of the bag inside the exterior piece so that the right sides are facing each other. So I'm going to slide it in here. Then we'll line up the side seams so that the lining side seam and the exterior side seam are over the top of each other. We'll line those up and pin all the way around the top edge. So I'll start by putting a pin at the side seams, and then I'll pin the edge between those 2 points. So now I have my pins all the way around my top edge, and I'm going to take the machine and stitch a 1/2 inch with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around the edge. It doesn't matter where I start, but I always start at one of the sides. So now the bag is fully sewn together and we just need to turn it. This part is really magical. So I'm going to take the lining piece and pull it out of the inside so that the 2 rectangles are facing each other and attached around the top edge. At this stage, your piece will kind of look like a wonky big pillow. So I have this, and then before we turn it, to reduce the bulk at the seam connection, I'm actually just going to trim out the seam allowances from either side of the side seam, just clipping back the little part of the side seam that is the seam allowance that we just made for this top edge. So I'm going to clip it out on the exterior side and then again clip it out on the lining side. And this just means that we'll have fewer layers of fabric once we open this seam and press it out. So I'm going to clip it out on the exterior side and then again clip it out on the lining side. And then I'm actually going to trim down the lining side seam allowance by half. This will help stagger the bulk of the seam allowance when the bag is turned. Clip in, and the resulting seam allowance will be about 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to trim all the way around the edge. With a thinner fabric, this wouldn't matter as much, but because we're using this thicker fabric for both the layers, it does kind of create a significant. So my lining side seam allowance is trimmed down by half, and my exterior seam allowance is the full length, and we trimmed out both of the seam allowance edges here at the side seam. So now I'll use the iron to press the seam allowance towards the lining, and I can actually use my hands to sort of help pull it apart, pull these two layers apart so that the seam connection lies really flat. So I'll do that, and then I can press this seam allowance flat. And it's important to set yourself up for success by pressing these out before you turn the bag, because once you turn the seam allowances to the inside, it'll be a lot harder to sort of adjust this. So I'll press that over. You can also take a minute to repress out your side seams, your bottom seam, if things have started to close back up. Now, to start the turn, find the opening in the bottom seam of the lining and stick your hand through it. Reach all the way to the opposite corner and find one of the bottom corners of the exterior of the bag. You can start feeding that corner back through this opening, and gradually you'll pull the entire bag through that seam opening until the pattern side of the bag is showing and all of the seam allowances are on the inside. So I'm just easing this through that hole and turning the entire thing inside out. You can see why we focused on backstitching at this seam opening, because with this turning process, we do kind of create a lot of stress right there. So now I have my bag right sides out, and the opening in the bottom has served its purpose, so we can close it up. I'm just going to arrange this a little bit flatter before we start that. So to close this up, you're going to hold the bottom seam of the lining and line up the two sides of the opening. Now, because we already pressed this crease, it should actually line up pretty automatically. You'll fold that seam allowance under the 1/2 inch, and then this lines up really nicely. We want the seam to lie flat on the bottom of the bag, so we're actually going to stitch this with a medium zigzag over the edge. And unlike a straight stitch that would pierce through the top and the bottom directly, the zigzag is a little more flexible and will actually roll out and lie flatter. So adjust the machine to a zigzag stitch at a stitch length between 2 and 3 and a width of 2. And then position the folded edge of the fabric under your foot so that when you are stitching, the right stitch will actually fall off the edge of the fabric and the left stitch will be on the fabric. And you want the opening, you want to start right before the opening. So you'll put your foot down and then you'll stitch with a back stitch, of course, just along the edge, just where you have that opening, not along the entire bottom. So I'm letting my stitch fall off the edge here, as you can see. And if you're having trouble, you can do a stitch length that's a little bit wider, maybe the width of a 3. And just can show you with this pin, that's where my opening ends. So we'll go right past the opening, do a little bit of a back stitch, and you can pull that out. And this closure, I can show you here. It may not lie completely flat, but it's pretty invisible, and it'll be at the bottom of the inside of the bag. And you can kind of see it. You can roll it out and you can press it, and it does lie pretty flat there. With the turning opening now closed off, we'll nest the lining inside the bag. The exterior fabric should fold over to the inside about 1.5 inches, and the bottom of the lining should be sitting directly inside the bottom of the exterior. So kind of open this up, and we'll be putting the bag inside of it. So I'm basically feeling the bottom of the lining and kind of pressing that into the bottom of the exterior, and that will sort of guide this top edge to fold over the correct amount. So I'm doing that on both sides, finding the bottom with my fingers, sort of pressing it down and nesting it directly into the bottom of the line, or the exterior here, holding that, kind of pinching that, and then folding this top edge up. So as you can sort of see, I have a rough approximate of about 1.5 inches fold. And then I will use my seam gauge to make sure that the facing is actually even all the way around the edge. So I'll start with one of the side seams and use the seam gauge. I want it to be 1.5 inches. I'll make sure when that's 1.5 inches that the lining is sitting directly in there. To secure this edge, I'm going to stitch around the top 1/4 inch from the fold. To make this really clean looking, I'll start stitching where I plan to put the tote bag strap so that the stitch connection is covered by the leather. I like the proportions with the strap dividing the bag in thirds. So I'll accordion fold the bag in thirds to figure out where that third mark will be. And this doesn't have to be super precise because we'll actually mark the strap positions based off each other. So I have this accordion in thirds, and I'm just going to pinch this out, and then I'll mark this 1/3 position with a pin. And that's where I'm going to start and finish the seam. So to make this edge a little bit easier to sew, I'm actually going to remove that bottom section so that the bag can move more easily around as I'm sewing. So I'm lining this up, and I'm just stitching 1/4 inch, top stitching and back stitching, and then that'll get covered by the strap. And if you do have to make any adjustments with the fabric, do put your needle in the fabric, because then if you adjust it and it kind of jerks it off the needle, the needle will be holding it in place, so you won't get a jagged line of stitching.
The whole oil bath thing.
So I've back stitched at the end, and then I'll take my bag off. Now the sewing part of the project is completely finished, and all we need to do is attach the leather straps. So I'm going to start by attaching one side of one strap, and then I'll actually mark the positions of the other attachments based off that. So position one strap centered over the area where you started and stopped the seam. So find that, and then you're going to actually overlap the strap onto the bag about 2 inches. So I'll use my seam gauge for that and make sure that looks like 1/3. Yep, we did that correctly. And then I'm actually going to mark the holes through the holes of the straps directly onto my fabric with my pencil. Or if you can't see the pencil for some reason, you can actually do this directly with the awl, starting that hole, and then you'll remove the strap. And with the positions marked, you'll take your awl, and we're going to make the holes for the hardware with the awl. So we'll push it through far enough to separate the fibers of the fabric about 3/16 of an inch. So the awl is graduated, so obviously as the farther you push the awl through, the larger the hole. And we're using the awl to push the fibers apart instead of cutting them. That way the hole won't fray or get larger over time, which makes it a little bit trickier to work with, but it makes it much stronger for continued use. So I've made my top hole, and then I'm making my second hole. We want them just large enough so that we can fit the post of the Chicago screw through. So I'm taking 2 of the Chicago screw backs, and that's the side with the incised top, and I'm poking them through the holes. And putting them. So I have them through the holes, and then I will take my strap. I'm going to line the strap up and place it so that I'm putting the holes of the strap right over the pegs of the Chicago screws. Then I'll take the cap, which is the side with the nice flat finish, and I'll place those over the pegs, and I'll just tighten them a little bit with my fingers to get them into place. So tightening them from the front. With my fingers, and then once those are in place, we can actually flip it to the back, and using the washer that you received in your kit, you can tighten them by holding the front face with your finger on the back and using the washer to fully tighten this, just like a screwdriver with a screw. So those are tightened on here, and now I'm going to repeat the process to attach the other 3 ends of the straps. First, I'm going to fold the bag in half, matching the side seams, and I'll actually mark the position of the other end of my strap by folding the bag in half and lining the strap up so that it matches directly and kind of mirrors here. And then I will double check that it's overlapping the bag 2 inches like I had with my first side, and then I will mark the position of that next set of holes, and I'll do the exact same process. And then once that is done, we'll actually mirror the position of the second strap based off the first strap. So once you've tightened all the screws, your tote is ready for adventure. Thanks so much for sewing with me today. I hope you had fun and learned a few new sewing skills. I brought Amelia back to show off our completed tote bag project. We love this project because it's easy to sew and creates a beautiful final product. The hardware and handles add a really lovely polished look to this everyday elevated bag.
We are Amelia and Emily, co-founders of Wildflower Delivery Co., and we look forward to sewing with you again soon. So please see the link below to check out our other sewing kits on our website and subscribe to our channel to stay in touch. Goodbye for now.